Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to the second session of our fourth day of the conference themed Abolition Now. We have our incredibly honored guest, Dr. Angela Davis, here today. And we're just going to take a couple minutes to let everyone get settled in. I know we have our in-person folks also getting settled. Wonderful. All right, I'll pass it to you, Brittany, to get started.
Thank you, Layla. And hi, everyone. My name is Brittany, and welcome back to our Rise and Revolution Conference, session 2 of day 4, Abolition Now. Thank you all so much for being here. And it is with great reverence that I welcome our esteemed speaker, Dr. Angela Yvonne Davis. Through her activism and scholarship over the last decades, Angela Davis has been deeply involved in our nation's quest for social justice. Her work as an educator, both at the university level and in the larger public sphere, has always emphasized the importance of building communities of struggle for economic, racial, and gender justice. Professor Davis's teaching career has taken her to San Francisco State University, Mills College, and UC Berkeley. She has also taught at UCLA, Vassar, the Claremont Colleges, and Stanford University. She spent the last 15 years at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she is now Distinguished Professor Emerita of History of Consciousness, an interdisciplinary PhD program, and of Feminist Studies.
Angela Davis is the author of 9 books and has lectured throughout the United States, as well as in Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia, and South America. In recent years, a persistent theme of her work has been the range of social problems associated with incarceration and the generalized criminalization of those communities that are most affected by poverty and racial discrimination. She draws upon her own experiences in the early 70s as a person who spent 18 months in jail and on trial after being placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. Davis has also conducted extensive research on numerous issues related to race, gender, and imprisonment. Her most recent book is Freedom is a Constant Struggle: Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement. Dr. Davis is a founding member of Critical Resistance, a national organization dedicated to the dismantling of the prison industrial complex. Internationally, she is affiliated with Sisters Inside, an abolitionist organization based in Queensland, Australia, that works in solidarity with women in prison. Like many other educators, Professor Davis is especially concerned with the general tendency to devote more resources and attention to the prison system than to educational institutions. Having helped to popularize the notion of a prison industrial complex, she now urges her audiences to think seriously about the future possibility of a world without prisons and to help forge a 21st century abolitionist movement. Dr. Davis, thank you again for being here. To be able to converse with and learn from you directly is absolutely surreal. Before we begin our moderated discussion, are there any opening statements or comments you'd like to share?
Well, let me perhaps, before we begin the conversation, simply thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of what appears to be a very exciting conference. I really love the theme, Rise and Revolution, and I'm so happy that you have chosen the book that I recently co-authored with 3 of my comrades, which is called Abolition, Feminism Now, to help structure the theme of this presentation. So thank you so much. And I guess with that, we can go into the conversation.
Wonderful. And so the book you just mentioned, we know that you recently released your book, Abolition, Feminism Now, co-authored alongside Gina Dent, Erica R. Miners, and Beth E. Ritchie. And as you just said, this actually did inspire the theme for today's conference sessions, as well as the overall conference structure. And so in this incredible book, all of you explain that the contemporary abolitionist movement has come from the 19th century anti-slavery movement. And you describe the use of abolition as similar to the use of revolution as, quote, amorphous, shape-shifting, defined only through use, end quote. What made you first get involved in activism and abolition work? And how have you seen the movement shift over the years? And what were the joys and struggles of that journey?
Well, you know, what a great question. I must admit that I'm going to attempt to be succinct here, because I could take up the rest of the time for the entire program addressing your question. You know, I don't know if I can really distinguish my involvement in activism from the way I grew up, from the people I was drawn toward, the issues that moved me in high school, my decision to study philosophy. I guess what I'm saying is that I don't really know whether there was a specific moment in which I saw myself transitioning from one way of being in the world to becoming an activist. I think all along, from the time I was very young, living in Birmingham, Alabama, which in the 1940s and 50s, the years I grew up, was the most segregated city in the United States. So I was reared with a sense of the need to build community. We instinctively knew that if we were ever going to be successful in pulling down some of the barriers that were created by racism, we would have to create community. We would have to stand together. We would have to unite. And so I think that I was aware from the time I was very young that in a sense I was expected to carry out a legacy that came from my forebears. And if I did not become involved in the struggle, I would be betraying that legacy. I would be betraying that legacy if I did not in some way help to advance the struggle for freedom. Now, I'm telling you this now, but I don't know whether I made a conscious decision in that way that people often think about the process that drives people to becoming activists. And certainly there may be some people who have a kind of epiphany that they want to shift many things in their lives so that they can begin to make contributions to this struggle for freedom. But I think I was born into this work. My mother was an activist. My mother was a radical activist, although she did not talk about it a great deal. And it took me a long time before I recognized the extent to which I was replicating my mother's path. And you know, of course, I love my mother very much, but we had disagreements, and I certainly did not see myself as following in my mother's footsteps. But it turns out I was. And then later, I might mention, I write about this in my autobiography, when I went to high school in New York, I read the Communist Manifesto in my history class. I was fortunate enough to attend a very progressive high school that was collaboratively owned by the teachers, most of whom had been, well, in those days they said blacklisted, some people say whitelisted, you know, from the public school system. So I remember the impact of the Communist Manifesto. Workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. And I think it was perhaps at that moment that I really imagined myself as a revolutionary. You know, I joined a number of radical organizations. I attended all kinds of marches and demonstrations in New York at that time. It was the peace movement. It was the movement against the bomb. I remember walking across the George Washington Bridge in this huge demonstration. Yeah, that was when I was, I think, 15 years old. But I also say that at the age of 11, I joined an interracial discussion group that was hosted by the church I attended. And that was the First Congregational Church in Birmingham. And as a consequence of the interracial discussion group, racist forces, probably members of the Ku Klux Klan, actually burned a portion of the church. Now, this was not the church that got bombed in 1963. And I think it's important for people to know that, churches and synagogues provided space for activism at a time when to be an activist could call forth the wrath of the Ku Klux Klan. It was not only the 16th Street Baptist Church that was bombed, but many churches were subject to dynamite. Synagogues were dynamited, people's houses. But that was the beginning of my trajectory. And of course, there have been many shifts since then, but I think we'll get to other moments in that journey as we move along in the questions.
Thank you so much for sharing that, and what an amazing trajectory and just arc of life that you have led. And so we understand that racism goes beyond interpersonal discrimination, but has everything to do with systemic impacts upon Black and Brown communities. We also understand capitalism to be a system that moves beyond the exchange of goods and services between individuals, but has everything to do with the economic systems in place that allow globalization to exist. Can you speak on racial capitalism, this term that originated with Cedric Robinson, and help us understand its legacy and how it's manifested today?
Well, first of all, thank you for that question. And I'm so happy that you chose to pose a question about capitalism and racial capitalism. Oftentimes, capitalism is the elephant in the room. It is that which is not discussed, even though we are all totally implicated in and determined by the work that capitalism does on our society and on us as individuals. Let me say that I think that some of the most important ideological work today that we should all be doing, young and old, is the questioning of the assumption that the individual is at the root of everything. And so recently I've been trying to make sure that I suggest that people engage in critiques of individualism. And I can begin by saying that some people may be familiar with my name, but I have never done anything alone. All of the things that might be attributed to me were always accomplished by groups and communities and collaborative approaches. You mentioned the book Abolition, Feminism Now in the first question, I believe. And that was a collaborative effort. 4 people wrote that book. And what was so amazing about it was that it became something that was very different from all of us as individuals. It acquired its own positionality, as a bringing together of ideas that represented very different people. And this is a part of our consciousness of capitalism, the desire our desire to challenge the assumption that capitalism often forces us to make, that individuals are responsible, for everything that happens in the world, and that something like acquisitive individualism, which is at the very heart of the ideologies of capitalism, is oftentimes left undiscussed. So there's so many ways in which I could teach, that I could speak about capitalism. I could actually, talk about the pain and suffering that capitalism creates by allowing for the monopolization of wealth in the hands of relatively few people. And of course, now we've all read about Elon Musk, billions, and Jeff Bezos, as if they've earned the right to have more wealth than many countries in the world. I'm sorry, I get very upset about that. It's just so, it's so obscene that people could be allowed to monopolize the wealth that is created by workers. Now, racial capitalism, I think this is an important term. As you point out in your question, Cedric Robinson introduced that term in the context of a book that he authored some years ago called Black Marxism. And Cedric was a dear friend of mine. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago. But when the point that he made was that capitalism and racism are not two discrete phenomena. We cannot talk about capitalism except in the context of capitalism having been produced and having developed as a direct consequence of colonialism, as a direct consequence of slavery. Capitalism would not exist without all of the wealth that was generated from the slave trade, the slave ships. I was in Belgium, as I said to you a couple of days ago, trying to point out that the wealth of that city is very much linked to the slave trade. It's very much linked to the colonization of the Congo, of Rwanda, and other parts of Africa. We often don't think about historical events that have unfolded so long before we're born. Again, this is a capitalist impulse to assume that the only valuable temporality starts with an individual and represents the lifetime of a human being. But if we look at indigenous temporalities, one question that some indigenous people ask is, how will your action affect people 7 generations from now? So we have to have the breadth of thinking and of imagining in order to ask ourselves about the impact of the work we do now, 7 generations from now. And so the impact of colonialism and slavery is still being felt today. The racial dimension of capitalism is perhaps its most essential dimension, in the sense that it was the structural racism of colonialism and of slavery that allowed for the accumulation of wealth that prodded the development of the capitalist system. And we're living the afterlives. We're still living the afterlives of colonialism and slavery. And the fact that we talk about structural racism has a great deal to do with the structures of colonialism, the structures of slavery.
Wow, that was incredible. And I love all of the different ideologies and concepts that you brought into your answer, especially considering temporalities and the indigenous perspective on temporalities. I'm a Tongan and Samoan, Fijian, French person. And, you know, one of the things that our scholars in Tonga and Samoa talk about, you know, Apeli Ha'ofa, Futa Helu, is this concept of spiral time, you know, and of things past, present, future, all existing simultaneously. And you cannot, there is no separation between them, exactly what you were just talking about. But I really appreciate your answer to that question. And I'm gonna pass it to you, Brittany, for the next question.
Thank you, Layla, and thank you to Dr. Davis for that response too. Yeah, I think it's really important that we emphasize that when it comes to racism and capitalism, we cannot talk about them separately. So I have the third question for you, which is in reference to the book we talked about earlier, Abolition, Feminism Now, which highlights, quote, the emergency response to the outbreak of the pandemic in Illinois, unquote, and how it was organized by groups composed largely of women of color, queer folks, and young people. So our question is, why is it important for these groups to be at the forefront in the fight for justice? Why is it important to make the shift from mainstream feminism, which is largely by and for white women, towards anti-racist feminism led largely by Black, Indigenous, and queer women of colors? How is this tied to making the leap from liberal demands to radical reform?
Well, again, a wonderful question. And I should tell you that 2 of the authors of Abolition Feminism Now, Beth Ritchie and Erica Miners, live in Chicago. Beth teaches at the University of Illinois in Chicago, and Erica teaches at the University of one of the University of Illinois campuses. I can't remember the exact one right now, but she teaches in the education department. And you know, both of them are amazing activists. They're not only incredible scholars who've written several books themselves, but they have been also involved in grassroots organizations in Chicago. Erica has done so much work around education and access to education and education in prisons. And as a matter of fact, they both invited me the year before the pandemic to do a graduation speech inside of Statesville Prison, which is outside of Chicago. Now, that chapter begins, that's the last chapter, chapter 4 now, right? And that chapter begins with a description of a demonstration that is taking place outside of the prison, Statesville. And it is a demonstration that is it's an automobile demonstration. It's a car demonstration. The cars are driving around the entire perimeter of the prison with all kinds of making all kinds of slogans and the use of a loudspeaker system. And so it's pointed out in the book that the majority of the demonstrators are women, queer, young people. And one of the points that we try to make in the book is that so often these are the groups that are responsible for organizing protests, for guaranteeing that radical approaches are incorporated into grassroots demonstrations. And oftentimes, however, it is assumed that it's primarily men who do the work. Why? Because it's usually the guys who get up and give the speeches. They're usually the ones who are visible. I apologize for coughing. I have a cold, and it is a cold. By the way, I talked to you about this before. Most people aren't aware of the fact that the membership of the Black Panther Party, back in the late 1960s, in the early 70s, was 66% women. The majority of people who were involved in the Black Panther Party were women. And incidentally, there's a new book that Erica Huggins, who was one of the leaders of the Black Panther Party at that time, a book of photographs that show how women were responsible for all of the programs, the survival programs, the free breakfast programs, the intercommunal school, the free healthcare programs. These were the programs that made the Black Panther Party such an important force in the community. And they were all run by women. I say this because I think it's important at this time for us to recognize the fact that basically women have always done the work. And this is true across racial and ethnic backgrounds. And at the same time, women have been the ones who haven't been acknowledged for doing that work. So one of the points that we make in this book that attempts to discuss the ways in which feminism is at its most powerful when it is also abolitionist, when it is anti-racist, when it is anti-capitalist, when it is abolitionist. And abolition, the strategy of abolition is most powerful when it is also feminist. And again, we don't necessarily think of abolition as a feminist approach. But I can tell you, as one of the people who was involved in organizing the conference of critical resistance that took place in 1998, which really introduced the prison industrial complex and abolition to large numbers of people, out of the 25 or so organizing committee members, I think 21 or 22 were women or non-binary people. And I think if one looks at the way most radical formations are organized, one will discover that women do the work. of women are responsible. And we're very fortunate to be living in the year 2022 because finally people are beginning to recognize this, not only in this country, but all over the world.
So powerful. Thank you. Sorry, Brittany, were you gonna hop in before I move on? No? Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Davis. I just really appreciate everything you're talking about. There's already just positivity and appreciation for you in the chat. And so moving on to the next question, man, I could talk to you for so long. This is just so incredible, but unfortunately our time is limited. So there is an article by Robin Kelly, which you are most likely familiar with, From the River to the Sea to Every Mountaintop, Solidarity is World Making. And you are referenced in this article. And Kelly places poetry, freedom movements, and her concept of world making into conversation. And there have been many poets over the years, such as Craig Santos Perez, Lee Kava, and Teresa Sengatonu, who will be joining us tomorrow, who've built on such ideas and demonstrate poetry as a decolonial liberatory tool. A prominent piece or theme of this conference is actually the role of the arts, especially poetry and music, as part of movement building, part of fostering empathy within and across communities, and also as part of imagining this liberated future that we're all striving towards. Could you tell us about a time where you saw art via music, poetry, dance, painting, etc., play a key role in a social movement, be it mobilizing a group of people, growing a movement beyond those directly affected, or even bridging division within a community?
Well, again, that's such an important question. And I am very happy that during this period of activism, we are recognizing the centrality of poetry and music and visual art. I think there's always been a recognition that you can't build a movement if you don't have that cultural dimension. But I can remember as a young activist, there was a tendency to treat poetry and music as a kind of relief, from the real work of organizing. So you would have a rally, and there would be powerful speakers, mostly male speakers, because that was the way things were at that time. And so they were the ones who were supposed to be handing down, the message. And then you would have, a poet, maybe even Gil Scott-Heron. But the poetry was not seen as being so central. Or you would have a musician, maybe Nina Simone. But the majority of people did not recognize at that time how essential it was to include that cultural dimension, and that, as a matter of fact, more people might possibly be moved by the music or the poetry than they were by the sometimes boring speeches that they heard. So, I mean, of course, I'm not saying that, all the speeches were boring. Some are. I'm sure I've given my share of boring speeches too. But the point that I do want to make, and I've seen this especially happening during this period in connection with the conjuncture that has been produced by the pandemic on the one hand, and the awareness of structural racism that came directly from witnessing, who was suffering most, who was dying, who the essential workers were. And then, of course, the official lynching of George Floyd and the police murder of Breonna Taylor. During this period, so many more poets and musicians and filmmakers and painters have explicitly used their work to further a more radical consciousness. And this hasn't always been the case because previously there was an assumption that art had to occupy a realm all by itself, that art could not be subordinated to politics. I don't think good art is ever subordinated to politics, but we know that that music and poetry can reach us in ways that a speech could never do. And I've come to recognize, and this is why I've been so impressed by all of the amazing cultural work of this period, that art can often lead us to feel, to emotionally experience what we don't yet know how to articulate in words. Art can give us a sense of where we're going before we are even aware or even able to say in words where we want to go. And in that sense, art is not just a major force in radical and revolutionary organizing, it is pivotal. Without art, there would not be the kind of imagination that would allow people to come together and experience a kind of collective imagination of the need for a better world. So, this is something that I could talk about forever because I'm, as a person whose field is philosophy, and I think, Brittany, you said you were interested in philosophy, right? I've always been interested in the kind of knowledge that gets produced by art, what you might call aesthetic knowledge, the aesthetic dimension. And I am so happy that I'm still around to witness this period of the flourishing of art and poetry and creativity and the awareness of how important the imagination is. And this is a point that Robin Kelly makes. You mentioned Robin Kelly at the beginning of the question, right? And Robin Kelly, whom I have known since he was a graduate student, by the way, has an amazing book called Freedom Dreams. And in some of the chapters of that book, he writes about how important art, surrealism, visual art, poetry, how important these modes of imagination were to the development of radical movements, Black movements, third world movements, movements against racism, anti-capitalist movements.
Wow, what you were talking about, knowledge production, it reminds me a lot of Foucault, and but it's a whole another a liberatory and like a radical version of that, and a positive version of that. And I'm fascinated by everything you just said, and I'm going to sit with it and go do a deep dive on Google later about everything you just discussed. But I'll pass it to you, Brittany, for the next question.
Thanks, Leila. Yeah, I just want to say that I loved what you said about poetry and music serving as a sort of relief for the organizing, and made me think about this week-long conference that we're hosting. Tomorrow's our final day, and we're ending it with this in-person celebration of joyful resistance with live performances and music and food. And yeah, I think we kind of did that without realizing that, yes, it is so essential to our movement for us to include, as you said, this cultural, add this cultural dimension to it. It just felt natural and very fitting to our conference. So moving on to our next question.
Well, may I just say
Yes.
one thing? You know, if you consider, how you feel when you're listening to music that is so moving, and you are aware not only of the beauty and the power of the music, but of the fact that you're experiencing this with other people too. And there's a kind of happiness, experience of happiness there that prefigures the world that we want to live in. And I think we have these moments in which we can get a sense of what the possibilities are if we continue to do the organizing that will bring about the change for a better world.
And what you just said also, it just really speaks to the specific role of art as that bridge. Art is inherently connecting and collective, as you just said, and it really speaks to that importance, and to reject, as you were discussing earlier, individualism, and seek to move and live and act in ways that are collective and communal. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this really highlights the importance of kind of community empowerment and allowing us to utilize every different form of art, every different medium, whether it's, poetry, spoken word, and connecting back to our Rise and Revolution conference. This was birthed as a result of the limited access to the necessary and critical tools that will ensure that our students, faculty, and community members feel empowered, informed, and prepared to tackle even the most seemingly complex societal issues that stain our world. So in other words, this project is centered around accountability and transformation. What do you see as the roles of folks across all levels of higher education, from students to staff to administrators, relative to their position in an institution that inherently upholds oppressive practices? Are these roles unique, or is this a case that calls for a more unified effort?
Well, very complicated question. Very complicated because, on the one hand, you talk about the fact that doing the work that you're doing and others who have a similar consciousness, or trying to share that consciousness through programming on the campus of an institution, which we know in general, the institutions of education have been very much involved in producing the structural racism that we're challenging. And I'll just be personal for a minute and tell you that some people have asked me, how is it that you manage to remain on these college and university campuses for so many years and decades? Especially when I was fired right after I got my first job, before I even had the opportunity to give my first lecture. And one of the things that I say is that these campuses are places where you're going to discover young people who first of all, want to learn. But second of all, many of whom recognize that learning is a process that ought to produce possibilities for a better world. If knowledge does not help to create a more habitable world, not only for human beings, but for our non-human co-inhabitants of this earth, then what good is it? I mean, ultimately, regardless of what you're studying, whether you're a scientist, whether you're in the arts, whether you're in the humanities, the social sciences, the learning that you do, the work that you will eventually do ought to make the world a better place in one way or another. And so the university, the colleges and the universities, the community colleges, four-year institutions, graduate institutions are places where young people are developing the capacity to produce knowledge that can change the world. And so why wouldn't one want to be there, even though one knows that the institution itself is totally complicit in the processes that have created the problem? One of the things that I've learned that over the years that I would really like to emphasize this evening is that we're always working through and within contradictions. We will never find a pure space. We will never find a situation in which all of the stars are perfectly aligned for us to do the work that we need to do. And I think we have to get used to working with contradictions and recognizing that contradictions can also produce phenomenal results if we embrace them, that we don't have to assume that everybody on the campus has to be involved in the same way. I mean, I can talk about differences and contradictions, but difference can be a powerful force. And I like to, you asked me what the roles might be of people in various positions in higher education. And I don't know whether one can define the roles in a formulaic way, because I've come to recognize that your most powerful activists will be those who learn how to love the work that they're doing. And therefore, the work that they're doing will have to express a kind of a way of creating fulfillment. I don't want people to do this work and see it simply as a sacrifice. And everybody always talks about activism as a sacrifice. People constantly thank me for my sacrifices. And I have to say, I don't feel like I've sacrificed anything. And that as a matter of fact, even the worst conditions that I have experienced have allowed me to learn. And I look at them now as so important to my development that I would never give up, for example, the time that I spent behind bars. To me, and I borrow this from Erica Huggins, who also spent time in jail. But to me, that period was a gift because it helped me find the meaning of my life. And had I not spent that time in jail, I don't think that I would be where I am today. And so it's about merging the individual. And let me say, I'm opposed to individualism, but I'm not opposed to individuality. And as a matter of fact, I think individualism militates against individuality. And so we have to discover our own individual passions. You know, what fulfills us, what allows us to feel as if we're flourishing. And then we figure out how to use those inclinations and those talents to participate in a collective process that is going to change the world. So I would say that that is the case from, for students, for staff members, for people who are teaching, faculty, etc. We don't want people who are going to just do this out of a sense of duty, and then get angry that, oh, I just wasted the last 5 years of my life because I didn't have any fun and I didn't, you know what I'm talking about. I think that the work that you all are doing is remarkable. I'm totally impressed by this Rise and Revolution conference that led you to figure out how you could encourage your co-students and the faculty and the community members to feel a sense of empowerment. The final thing I'm going to say in response to this question is that we don't have to assume that unity requires moving beyond differences or across differences. And this is something that's hard to conceptualize because we've all been trained to think about unity as the product of that which we all have in common, right? Not of our differences. And I think we have to begin to think in a more complicated way how differences can bring us together. I don't want to be in a room with everybody who's exactly like me and thinks like me. I'm not learning anything. I'm not being challenged. And at this particular moment, I think that we can begin to ask ourselves, how can difference serve as the very glue that brings us together?
That was just incredible. I'm still reeling from one of the things that you said, which Jackie actually put in the chat. We will never find a pure space. This idea that you're putting forth about living in contradiction, living in nuance, and accepting that is just incredible. And it going back to the arts thing, it's similar to like a harmony, right? Or like a symphony and orchestra. There's so many different, unique, like individual pieces, but it all comes together to create something, as you were discussing with the book, that takes a life of its own, the collective as its own unique entity. And that's just incredible. This is amazing. And so, yes, Dr. Malathi Iyengar put in the chat, difference as the glue that binds us together. Beautiful. And so it is 6:27. I know we should be heading into the open Q&A from the all of the audience members. What an incredible opportunity. And so let's see, we have 2 questions in the Q&A section that we can start off with. But yes, just to remind all of the folks watching, you can either type in your questions into the chat or to the Q&A section, or if you would be so inclined as to actually unmute, turn your video on if you'd like, and ask Dr. Davis your question directly, you have that ability. If you would like to click the raise hand function, Roger will give you permission to do so. And so starting with the first question we have from Donna, have you ever worked with lesbian peace activist Barbara Deming? And what is your current thinking on nonviolent revolution?
Actually, yes, I have. But quite some time ago. And I was just, I was just thinking the other day, particularly in relation to the war in Ukraine, that it's been a long time since we've heard about the importance of peace movements, of anti-war movements. And so it was almost as if we didn't know how to mobilize and respond to the Russian assault on Ukraine. But if people are aware of the ways in which anti-war movements developed over the decades from World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, they're also aware that all kinds of connections were made, that it wasn't simply the war that was the focus, but also the connection of, say, World War II and which was for many people a war to defeat fascism, and that people were making connections to racism. Racism in places like South Africa, racism in the US. As a matter of fact, in the United States, there was what was called a double V movement, double victory. Victory against fascism abroad, victory against racism at home. One of the reasons we're not aware of that history, outside of a pretty relatively small group of people, is that these campaigns were largely initiated by communists. And if one considers the damage that the anti-communist thrusts has done to our country, we're not even aware of how the history itself has unfolded, because they do not want students to understand that communists were central in the development of the most important movements in this country. As a matter of fact, the civil rights movement that began in, say, that would periodize as beginning in 1955 with the Montgomery bus boycott. Before that, people like my mother, who was, she wasn't a communist, but she was involved in the national, what was it called? The National Negro Youth Congress, which was organized by Black members of the Communist Party, and also W.E.B. Du Bois. But nobody hears about the work that was done prior to 1955, or about the fact that Rosa Parks was involved in some of those campaigns that involved fighting for justice for a Black woman who was gang raped by young white Ku Klux Klan members in a little town called Abbeville, Alabama. And how all of the organizing work laid the terrain for the Montgomery Improvement Association, which was the organization around which the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 was organized. So Yeah, and I'm happy that the person who asked the question brought up that history, the peace movements, anti-war movements, their connections with anti-racist movements. We could use that knowledge now as we address what's happening in the Ukraine. And at the same time, the racism that is being expressed out there. I have to tell you, I was in Brussels 2 days ago, speaking at a big event, a wonderful event that was largely organized by Afro-descendant women, Muslim women, groups of women we might refer to as women of color in the US. And what was so remarkable was that they had no difficulty talking about their support for Ukrainian people who were suffering under the assault of the Russians. But at the same time, they were critical of the fact that African students were not allowed to cross the border. And they were pointing out other examples of racism. And this is an indication that we can do this work without having to have a space that's totally clear of contradictions. That we always have to work with those contradictions, and sometimes we're working inside of the contradictions.
Wow, thank you. Awesome question and also amazing response, Dr. Davis. Thank you for bringing up how that a lot of this history is put on the back burner, really just neglected because of anti-communist sentiments. And also thank you for bringing up this connection to the Russian assault on the Ukrainian people. I know we have some raised hands, so if those people could be given access to speak and ask their questions.
All right, we have a question in building 17.
Hi, can they hear me? Right? Yeah, okay. Hello, I just want to say hi. So my name is Megan Lauren Bueno, and it is a complete honor to be in your presence. And I'm just someone who is inspired by you, and also I've always wanted to become like a therapist, and I just wanted to, well, mostly just go into mental health. And I was just kind of just like wondering, how are you? Like, do people ever ask you that? Like, especially like, of course, in the times we live in, and just like here, I'm kind of nervous right now, but like, I just wanted to ask you, again, do people ever ask you that? How are you? Like.
Well, thank you so much, and I think that it's so important for us to be sincerely concerned about our friends, our comrades, those with whom we occupy space, because this has been a very difficult period. And, since you want to become a psychotherapist, I'm sure you're aware of how much more difficult it has been over this last period for people to maintain themselves in mental health and physical health. I'm, as a person who was many years ago involved in an organization called the National Black Women's Health Project, I learned, and I'm so fortunate for that experience, Billy Avery was the founder of the organization, that when we talk about health, we consider not only physical health and not only mental health, but also spiritual health. And so I've tried to be attentive not only to my own needs, but to the needs of my people, my friends, my sisters and brothers and siblings and comrades. Because for so long as radicals, as revolutionaries, we were sort of taught that you have to be strong. And, of course, there is this assumption, historical assumption, that in order for a Black woman to make valuable contributions, she has to be really strong, right? And so you work to develop that strength, but you don't take into consideration your own vulnerability, and you don't allow yourself to experience yourself as fragile, which all human beings are. And so I'm so thankful to have survived until this moment when I can see, new discourses emerging and new ways of addressing health. And of course, as someone who has been an abolitionist and working toward abolitionist strategies with respect to prisons and police and child protective services and so forth, I can say that we don't have the strategies we need to help assure the health, and especially the mental health and spiritual health of people in our community. And as a matter of fact, a powerful argument for police abolition, but also for prison abolition, et cetera, is the fact that the majority of police calls involve services. The majority of police calls do not involve crimes, but rather someone in crisis, for example, who needs to be assisted. And why is it that the only force we have to send is a force that consists of armed people? Why not people who are trained to understand, what it means to experience a breakdown, a mental or emotional breakdown? And why not people who have the tools, people who are compassionate? So this awareness that you are gesturing toward when you asked me how I was feeling has come to help us understand how much more capacious our sense of what we need as human beings has to be, and particularly, looking at issues of sexuality and attacks on the LGBTQ community, attacks on trans people, the violence that is inflicted on especially trans women of color. These are signs that we have to figure out how to develop new institutions, how not to have to rely on a police force that is so structurally racist and that comes out of slavery, prisons that only reproduce the violence that they purport to address.
Amazing. Are there any other questions from the village before we move into some of the typed out questions? Nope. Okay. Well, I did see a particularly interesting question, actually from my sister. It's been incredible to have my family, my mom, my sister's support, and my aunt. Anyways, she says, question for Dr. Davis. In light of the pandemic and changes in labor across all sectors, labor shortages, people living paycheck to paycheck, wage and quality of work discrepancy, reevaluation of work-life balance, and the opportunity for remote work in so many sectors, what are the barriers for or what might spark a revitalized labor movement now?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. And I'm saying this because when is May 1st?
Sunday, I believe.
Monday,
Monday.
May 1st is on Monday, isn't it? Which is International Workers' Day, right? All over the world, unions and formations of working class people will be celebrating this holiday that the US tried to basically eradicate by creating Labor Day. It's because Labor Day was not supposed to be such a radical way of expressing the work that working people do. But I love that question because it again links capitalism, global capitalism, to this particular historical conjuncture. And, first of all, we think about the pandemic as only about the emergence of a particular virus, and it's making its way all over the world. But if we think about what created the emergency, what created the catastrophes, it was the lack of a healthcare system that could treat people. You remember at the beginning of the pandemic where we were seeing, all of these makeshift hospitals and makeshift morgues as a result. And that was a consequence largely of the privatization of healthcare and the creation of healthcare institutions that thrive on profit. Profit is what drives almost everything now. And profit should not be a concern when you're talking about the well-being of human beings. And so therefore, one important element of the problems created by the pandemic was that there were no hospital beds. But why were there no hospital beds? Because with the wave of privatization of hospitals, an empty hospital bed became a non-profitable bed. And so therefore, all of the hospitals moved to guarantee that there would be as few as possible beds that were not filled. That's just so absurd. It's ridiculous. And to think that people died because somebody wanted to make money on providing healthcare to people. Now, we could also say the same thing about institutions like the university that are thoroughly privatized. Even the public colleges and universities are affected by this system of profit. And if one looks at how tuition and fees have gone up enormously, over the last period, I can actually remember when in the state of California, education was free, literally. And my family came to California. Not my mother and father, but my cousins and my aunts and uncles emigrated to California because education was free here. And of course, that's no longer the case because of the fact that capitalism has defined how we provide goods and services to people. And it's obscene. You know, I'll say over and over again, if you think about it, it makes no sense at all. Why do some people have to die in order for others to accumulate more wealth that exists in some countries in the world? So in that sense, unions are so important. But you asked specifically about the role of unions today, and I've lost the question. I guess it was in the chat, right? You know, far fewer people are actually organized into unions today than they were 20 years ago. And that has a great deal to do with the impact of global capitalism. And big firms like Amazon and Starbucks that do not want their workers to organize. Fortunately, we're witnessing some, excuse me, we're witnessing some very important organizing. Let me have a sip of tea. I have a cold. I apologize to everyone.
Please do not apologize. Take all the time and tea sips and anything you need.
Well, I'll just conclude by saying that I could go on and on addressing this amazing question. But I do want to tell you that I am an honorary member of the International Longshore and Warehouse Workers Union. I was inducted into the union, I think about a year ago. And I'm planning to march with them in the demonstration on May 1st.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Davis. We have another question in the Village Hub if you guys wanted to unmute and share.
Hello, Angela. My name is Guillermo from OC San Mateo. My question to you, and also I'm so glad I came to this meeting. I was able to learn more about you, even though I didn't know who you were at the beginning. I'm glad that I have the chance to ask this question to you. In my childhood, I was someone who never had the freedom of race in revolution, and as someone like you who indeed was raised in it and keeps rising revolution for yourself and others, something I am sorry, and correct me, or please tell me, let me know if this is offensive at all, but I know you went to prison, and most of the time I felt that I have been in some sort of prison mentally, because I was, and I'm still not able to speak up and tell people the way I feel, or speak my emotions and say the things I need to say to advocate for myself. So you being in prison and understanding and contrasting your life now and having so much liberation for your own thoughts and yourself, how freeing you think do we ever really free ourselves from our default mindset? Do we ever get out of our own prison kind of thing? And if so, how can we liberate ourselves? Because I admire how free and careless and carefree of sharing your emotions and sharing who you are. You present yourself as.
Well, Thank you, Guillermo, for the question. And I think it's a question about the nature of freedom, a philosophical question about the nature of freedom. And I would begin to craft a response by saying that we have been so trained to think of freedom as something discrete, as something that we can describe in ways that are primarily individualized. And I don't think that freedom is primarily about the individual. I think that freedom is about communities. It's about people who live and work together, or maybe not even that. Perhaps we have to imagine ourselves as a part of a global community, and our sense of freedom has to be extended to all of those who inhabit this planet. I'm just going to point toward a remark that Toni Morrison, the amazing novelist and writer, made in a graduation speech that she gave some years ago. She said that freedom is always about freeing someone else. So the very purpose of freedom, I think she used the term function. The function of freedom is to free someone else. So that if I only think about myself and how I can be free myself, that I'm not really understanding the nature of freedom. And I would also point out that our sense of what constitutes freedom evolves as we accomplish more and more. Our sense of what the meaning of freedom is becomes more capacious. And I often point out that if one looks at the Black movement, and if one looks at the Latinx movement, also one sees, initially the assumption that freedom is a state that can be achieved by the Black man, by the Latino man. It's a masculinist definition of freedom. As a matter of fact, man is supposed to stand in for human. And therefore, we become, very confused about, what freedom is really about and the gendered character of freedom. But then women, Black women have stood up, Chicana women, Puerto Rican women, when one looks at the Young Lords and the involvement of large numbers of Puerto Rican women as leaders in that organization, when one looks at how the Chicana feminist movement on the West Coast helped to create the foundation for a different kind of feminism that is anti-racist and anti-capitalist. I think about Shiri Moraga and Gloria Anzaldúa and the important work that they did to help us understand that freedom is so much bigger than how it is we are urged to conceptualize freedom. We think about freedom as being the right to do something, not to. Look at all of these people who think they are defending their freedoms by refusing to wear masks and by refusing to get vaccinated. And in the process, they may be responsible for the illness and even death of others. So I would just urge you to think about freedom as a collective phenomenon and as something that cannot be defined in the usual ways in which we demand to know the meanings of things. That, if freedom evolved from, let me put it this way, yeah. Because now, we have a much more complicated assumption about what it is we need if we're going to begin to move in the direction of freedom. We not only consider the man in the movement, we think about the women, but then we recognize that the very category women is sometimes a flattening category and does not include women of color, does not include trans women, for example. And so I think that, I don't know whether we will ever reach a point where we will say that we're all free, because there will always be something else to make us recognize that the struggle continues. And some people might be disappointed by that because they want freedom to be a destination. But I like to think of freedom as a journey, an infinite journey that continues to help us move toward a future that will save the planet. And I'm just realizing, I'm so sorry that we didn't get to talk about environmental issues and climate issues and that connection with the struggle for freedom. But let me just say that the very condition of possibility for any other victories and social justice struggles is precisely the effort to save the environment, not only for the human inhabitants of the earth, but for all of the inhabitants of this planet.
Wow, that was an awesome question to end off today's session. Unfortunately, we reached the end of the time we have together, and I really wish we could keep going for hours and hours, because you even mentioned there are so many topics that we can cover and all these different intersections to talk about. I love that you brought up collective liberation, because that's exactly the goal of this conference. It's to reimagine, revolutionize, and radicalize what that looks like, and to include all these different identities into this liberation. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Davis, for joining us today. We are so grateful to be able to share this space with you, and we can't thank you enough for taking the time to join us here.